From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Healthcare is working along very well. We could have a big surprise with a great healthcare package. So now they're happy.
What do you mean by big surprise, sir?
I think you're going to have a great surprise. It's going to be great.
As the deeply unpopular health care plan fails to come to a vote before the Senate recessed for the holidays early yesterday, demonstrators flooded the offices of Republicans in what they're calling a last stand to prevent a repeal of the Affordable Care Act. We'll speak with disability rights attorney and activist Stephanie Woodward, who was ripped from her wheelchair and arrested for protesting outside Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's office. The video went viral. Look at how support for a nationwide single-payer health care system is growing. At least one poll shows a full third of Americans are now in favor of Medicare for all, and 60% believe the federal government should be responsible for health care. We'll go to California, where the state Senate passed a single-payer bill, but the House Speaker killed it in the Assembly. We'll get the latest from Michael Lighty with National Nurses United. Then part two of our conversation with the best-selling author and journalist Naomi Klein on her new book, No Is Not Enough: Resisting Trump Shock Politics and Winning the World We Need.
The reason why I wrote this book very quickly, for me, it usually takes me 5 years to write a book. I did this in less than 5 months, is because I really wanted it to come out before any kind of major crisis hits the United States.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump urged the Republican Congress today to repeal the Affordable Care Act, even as senators began leaving Washington, D.C. early for the 4th of July recess with no plans in sight to vote on a replacement health care bill. In a tweet early this morning, Trump wrote, "If Republican senators are unable to pass what they're working on now, they should immediately repeal and then replace at a later date." Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell called off a planned vote on a Senate health care bill after some members of his party balked over a Congressional Budget Office report that found it would add 22 million Americans to the ranks of the uninsured. Other Republicans said they'd oppose the Senate bill because it doesn't go far enough. In Washington, D.C., President Trump sparked outrage even among members of his own Republican Party Thursday after he attacked talk show host Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski of MSNBC's Morning Joe program. In a Twitter rant on Thursday morning, Trump tweeted, "I heard poorly rated Morning Joe speaks badly of me, don't watch anymore. Then how come low IQ crazy Mika, along with Psycho Joe, came to Mar-a-Lago 3 nights in a row around New Year's Eve and insisted on joining me? She was bleeding badly from a facelift. I said no," the president tweeted. Well, today, Mika Brzezinski responded on her program.
It does worry me about the country. And I know we have Richard Haass with us. He appears to have a fragile, impetuous, childlike ego that we've seen over and over again, especially with women. It's like he can't take it.
Writing in today's Washington Post, Brzezinski and Scarborough suggested Donald Trump is not well, adding, "America's leaders and allies are asking themselves yet again whether this man is fit to be president." Trump's tweets drew fire across the political spectrum, including from Republican Congressmember Ling Jenkins of Kansas, who tweeted, "This is not okay. As a female in politics, I am often criticized for my looks. We should be working to empower women," she said. In Washington, the White House was unapologetic over the comments. This is Deputy White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
This is a president who fights fire with fire and certainly will not be allowed to be bullied by liberal media and the liberal elites within the media or Hollywood or anywhere else.
Trump's attack on Mika Brzezinski came a day after he interrupted a phone call congratulating Ireland's new prime minister on his election victory to single out a female reporter from Ireland.
We have a lot of Well, we have a lot of your Irish press watching us. They're just now leaving the room. And where are you from? Go ahead. Come here. Come here. Where are you from? We have all of this beautiful Irish press. Where are you from?
I'm from RTE News. The Taoiseach will know me.
Oh, good.
Katrina Perry here. Taoiseach.
Katrina Perry. She has a nice smile on her face, so I bet she treats you well.
Katrina Perry later recalled the incident as bizarre. Trump has a history of sexist comments. In a leaked 2005 Access Hollywood video, Trump is caught on a hot microphone openly boasting about sexually assaulting women. During a presidential debate in 2015, Trump was questioned by then Fox News anchor Megyn Kelly about his history of sexist comments.
You've called women you don't like fat pigs, dogs, slobs, and disgusting animals. Your Twitter account...
Only Rosie O'Donnell.
No, it wasn't. Your Twitter account...
Thank you.
For the record, it was well beyond Rosie O'Donnell.
Yes, I'm sure it was.
After Megyn Kelly questioned Trump, he attacked her on the campaign trail. This is Donald Trump speaking in August of 2015.
She gets out and she starts asking me all sorts of ridiculous questions. And, you know, you could see there was blood coming out of her eyes, blood coming out of her wherever.
At least 13 women have accused Donald Trump of unwanted sexual advances. A now-deceased Republican opposition researcher, Peter W. Smith, with ties to ousted National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, contacted hackers in the midst of the 2016 election campaign, hoping they had emails hacked from Hillary Clinton's personal server. That's according to a Wall Street Journal expose that was published on Thursday. According to the Journal, Smith explicitly outlined his connection with Flynn in his recruiting emails. In one email, Smith said Flynn's son, Michael G. Flynn, was helping with the effort. Trump and his administration have long maintained there's no evidence of collusion between Russian operatives and Trump campaign associates. The United Nations warns humanity has just 3 years left to dramatically lower greenhouse gas emissions or risk facing a world that's uninhabitable to many of its residents. The warning by 6 climate experts was published in the journal Nature. It finds that without immediate action by 2020, the Earth's average temperature will rise by more than the 2-degree Celsius upper limit set by the Paris Climate Accord. The warning came as German Chancellor Angela Merkel has said this year's G20 summit in Hamburg will focus on climate change.
The European Union stands fully behind its Paris commitment, and it will rapidly and decisively implement the agreement. Furthermore, since the decision by the United States of America to leave the Paris climate deal, we are more determined than ever to make it a success.
The White House announced that Donald Trump will be meeting with Vladimir Putin next week at the G20. Meanwhile, Dutch banking giant ING said Wednesday it would not finance major pipeline projects in Canada over concerns about the impact of tar sands extraction on First Nations communities and the climate. And in Ireland, President Michael Higgins is poised to sign a bill that will ban onshore fracking across the country. Ireland joins Bulgaria, France and Germany among EU countries banning the drilling practice. Meanwhile, in Tacoma, Washington, members of the Puyallup tribe and their allies held a protest on Thursday at the construction site of a liquefied natural gas facility. The protest came ahead of a July 14th court appearance for 6 water protectors who chained themselves to construction equipment at the site in a bid to halt the project, which would hold up to 8 million gallons of liquefied fracked gas near a residential neighborhood. Iraq's army on Thursday declared an end to the so-called Islamic Caliphate as the U.S.-backed coalition captured the ruins of the Grand al-Nuri Mosque in Mosul from ISIS. The mosque was the site where ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared the caliphate in 2014. Its capture came as Iranian media reported Baghdadi is definitely dead. That follows Russian reports last month that Baghdadi died in a Russian airstrike in Syria. Meanwhile, heavy fighting continues in parts of Mosul, where tens of thousands remain trapped in the old city with little access to food, water and medicine. The journalistic monitoring group Air Wars reports at least 80 civilians were killed Thursday after shelling and airstrikes hit their houses around the Grand al-Nuri Mosque. That follows reports a family of 5 was killed and a 4-year-old boy severely injured in an airstrike by the U.S.-led coalition on Tuesday. In France, a 43-year-old Armenian man was arrested Thursday after attempting to ram his SUV into a crowd outside a mosque. Witnesses say the driver was thwarted in his attempts to kill Muslims only because his vehicle struck barriers put in place to protect the mosque. In Hong Kong, Chinese President Xi Jinping inspected thousands of People's Liberation Army soldiers today in the largest military parade Hong Kong has seen since Britain handed over control of the territory in 1997. President Xi's visit came amidst a massive security lockdown after police arrested pro-democracy demonstrators calling for greater autonomy in Hong Kong under the so-called one country, two systems policy. Among those arrested was Joshua Wong, who helped lead massive protests 3 years ago, calling for greater political freedom. This is Hong Kong legislator and activist Claudia Mo.
Need this Chinese leader to know that the one country, two system promise has been a sham, a fraud and a cheat. This non-stop Beijing interference in Hong Kong's development, especially in the political development, we're very, very resentful about not having true democracy.
At the Vatican, a senior cardinal and top advisor to Pope Francis will return to Australia to face charges of sexual assault. Cardinal George Pell is the third highest-ranking official in the Roman Catholic Church. Speaking from the Vatican, Cardinal Pell said Pope Francis granted him a leave of absence to return to Australia to defend himself.
I'm looking forward, finally, to having my day in court. I'm innocent of these charges. They are false. The whole idea of sexual abuse is abhorrent to me.
Pell has been ordered to appear in court next month. In 2014, the Vatican admitted nearly 850 priests have been dismissed and more than 2,500 have been disciplined in a sprawling sexual abuse scandal dating back decades. Back in the United States, the House of Representatives passed a pair of immigration bills Thursday that critics say are aimed at demonizing undocumented immigrants. The first bill, known as Kate's Law, adds penalties to deported immigrants who re-enter the U.S. It was approved on a vote of 257 to 167, mostly along party lines. Among those opposed was New York Democrat Gerald Nadler.
This bill is nothing less than fear-mongering, based on the widely debunked myth that immigrants commit crimes at a higher rate than native-born Americans, when in fact we know it is just the opposite.
The second House bill, approved Thursday, would cut off federal grants from sanctuary cities that limit cooperation with immigration authorities. In more immigration news, attorneys general in 10 states say they'll sue the Trump administration unless it ends the DACA program. That's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which grants legal protection for young immigrants to live and work in the United States. In a letter sent to U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions Thursday, Ken Paxton of Texas and 9 other Republican attorneys general say they're prepared to challenge the entire DACA program in court unless the White House rescinds the policy. President Trump's ban on refugees and travelers from 6 majority Muslim nations went partially into effect Thursday evening. Under a Supreme Court ruling earlier this week lifting a stay against the ban, people from Iran, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Sudan and Yemen who don't have close family or business relationships may be denied visas and kept out of the U.S. On Thursday, the Trump administration said it'll interpret close family to mean parents, children, siblings and in-laws. Among those excluded will be grandparents, grandchildren, uncles, aunts, and cousins. The State Department said late Thursday it'll allow fiancés from the affected countries to travel after initially saying they, too, would be banned. An election commission established by President Trump has asked all 50 states to hand over detailed personal information about U.S. voters in a move that civil rights advocates say is aimed at suppressing voter turnout. The request was made by Chris Kobach, the Kansas Secretary of State and vice chair of Trump's Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. Kobach has pushed for the strictest voter identification laws in the country and advocated for a proof of citizenship requirement at the state and federal levels. At least 3 states, California, Connecticut, and Virginia, said they will refuse to comply with the request. In a statement, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law said, quote, this meritless inquisition opens the door for a misguided and ill-advised commission to take steps to target and harass voters and could lead to purging of the voter rolls, unquote. And Germany's lower house of parliament Thursday voted by a wide margin to legalize same-sex marriage. The bill, which also allows same-sex couples to adopt children, is expected to sail now through Germany's upper house next week. Chancellor Angela Merkel voted no, saying marriage should only be between women and men. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump urged the Republican Congress today to repeal the Affordable Care Act, even as senators recessed for the holidays early yesterday, with no plans in sight to vote on a replacement health care bill. In a tweet early this morning, President Trump tweeted, "If Republican senators are unable to pass what they're working on now, they should immediately repeal and then replace at a later date," unquote. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell called off a planned vote on a Senate health care bill after some members of his party balked over a Congressional Budget Office report that found it would add 22 million Americans to the ranks of the uninsured. Other Republicans said they'd oppose the Senate bill because it doesn't go far enough. Meanwhile, support for a nationwide single-payer health care system is growing. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren became the latest politician to back single-payer. In an interview with the Wall Street Journal Tuesday, Warren said, quote, "President Obama tried to move us forward with health care coverage by using a conservative model that came from one of the conservative think tanks that had been advanced by a Republican governor in Massachusetts. Now it's time for the next step, and the next step is single payer," she said. Billionaire investor Warren Buffett also came out in favor of single payer this week, saying, quote, "We are such a rich country, in a sense we can afford to do it," unquote. A recent poll by the Pew Research Center shows a full third of Americans are now in favor of a national single-payer system. However, on Friday, California Assembly Speaker Anthony Rendon shelved a proposal to establish a single-payer system across California, saying the bill will not be voted on this year. The struggle over single payer comes amidst widespread backlash and protests against the Republicans' health care plan, which the Congressional Budget Office says would cause 22 million Americans to lose their health insurance over the next decade. In Washington, D.C., Planned Parenthood staged a people's filibuster against the legislation Tuesday. The protest included dozens of women dressing in red cloaks and white bonnets, inspired by the dystopian novel and TV series The Handmaid's Tale, about a totalitarian theocracy which overthrows the U.S. government and imposes power by subjugating women and controlling their reproductive rights. On Capitol Hill, demonstrators flooded the offices of several Republican senators in what they called a last stand to prevent a repeal of the Affordable Care Act. At a sit-in protest at the offices of Pennsylvania's Pat Toomey, protesters chanted, "Kill the bill, don't kill me." Similar protests targeted Senators Tom Cotton of Arkansas, Marco Rubio of Florida, Rob Portman of Ohio, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, where they were met by Murkowski's aide, Kevin Sweeney.
Senator Murkowski is a very deliberate senator. Senator Murkowski, and she's shown this in the past. She's shown this in the past that she wants to do what's right for Alaska, but she needs to know exactly what it is that she's doing. She wants to know what the impact this is going to be on Alaskans.
It's going to kill people. It's not hard to figure out.
22 million Americans from their insurance.
This bill already has actuarial tables attached to it, as obviously drafts, that show the only way these numbers come about through the CBO is if people die early.
During Wednesday's protests, police arrested 40 people on misdemeanor charges of unlawful crowding and obstructing. Meanwhile, activist disability rights group ADAPT launched a 2-day-long sit-in at the office of Colorado Republican Senator Cory Gardner, staging a die-in and chanting, "Better to go to jail than die without Medicaid." 10 activists with ADAPT were arrested Thursday. For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Stephanie Woodward, an organizer with ADAPT. Video went viral of her being ripped from her wheelchair and arrested for protesting outside Mitch McConnell's office. She has now been arrested while protesting 14 times. Let's go to that video clip of Stephanie Woodward being arrested. Stephanie Woodward's recent column for Vox is, "I was pulled out of my wheelchair by police. It could be worse. Trump care could pass." She joins us now from Washington, D.C., an organizer with ADAPT and a disability rights attorney. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Stephanie. Talk about what happened.
Well, a bunch of disability rights activists from ADAPT, about 60 of us, went to Mitch McConnell's office. Many of us were inside of his office, and those who couldn't fit in were outside in the hallway, and we staged a die-in to demonstrate that people with disabilities will die with these proposed cuts of over $800 billion in cuts to Medicaid, and we're not just going to sit around and be quiet when you're proposing to kill us.
So talk about what happened, how you organized, and explain just what ADAPT is, Stephanie.
Civil disobedience group. We engage in civil disobedience after every other step doesn't work. So we do meetings, we do advocacy in what people view as the polite way. And when that doesn't work, we do civil disobedience to prove that we will fight for our rights. And ADAPT has been around for over 30 years. We started with fighting for lifts on buses, which, proud to say, we clearly achieved, providing more access to everybody throughout our nation. And now we've mostly focused on long-term home and community-based services, meaning that we don't think that people with disabilities should be forced into nursing facilities just because they need help, or other institutions just because we need some help. We strongly believe that it's a right to live in liberty, a constitutional right to live in the community. So we fight for community-based services, and the proposed bill would make significant cuts to community-based services.
And talk about where you were, why you chose to target the senator you did, and then how the police responded to you and others in ADAPT.
Well, as the majority leader, I think that Mitch McConnell was an obvious choice for us. Leading this bill that would take away our life and liberty means that you're the person that we need to confront about this first. So that's why we chose Mitch McConnell. We stayed in his office. The people in the hallway were arrested first, mostly because they were the easiest to get to, I assume. And we were there for about an hour before they got to the Mitch McConnell's office and started carrying us out individually as well. And the police were doing their job, but we were doing our job, and it just so happens that our jobs conflicted that day.
So President Trump, when he was running for president, talked about Medicare and Medicaid. I want to go to May 21st, 2015, when he was speaking to the right-wing outlet, The Daily Signal.
I'm not going to cut Social Security like every other Republican, and I'm not going to cut Medicare or Medicaid. Every other Republican's going to cut. And even if they wouldn't, they don't know what to do because they don't know where the money is. I do.
So that was Donald Trump 2 years ago. Stephanie Woodward, explain exactly what the cuts are that are proposed in the Republican health care plan.
So what we're seeing is over $800 billion in cuts to Medicaid. And for us in the disability community, that means that nursing facility services are a mandatory benefit under Medicaid. Home and community-based services, although they are oftentimes cheaper, are an optional service. So when states have caps or cuts to their Medicaid, what they have to do is get rid of their optional services first, because you have to do the mandatory things. So for people with disabilities, what that means is people who are living in the community will lose their community-based services and be forced into nursing facilities or be forced to live in the community without the supports that they need, leaving them in danger of losing their life or losing their liberty, depending on which way they choose to go.
What exactly would happen to you, Stephanie Woodward, if this Republican health care bill became law?
I want to be clear. I depended on Medicaid until I was 25. I am not dependent on Medicaid at all right now. However, there are millions of people with disabilities who are, and I was part of this group because I won't stand by and let my brothers and sisters with disabilities across the nation have their life and liberty in danger because of a bill. So while I may not be as impacted, the people I love do, and the people I don't know but I care about their lives will be impacted, and that's why we all came together. There's a very diverse group of us, and everyone would be impacted in different ways, but none of us want to see this go through.
Stephanie Woodward, I want to thank you for being with us, organizer with ADAPT, disability rights attorney. Video of her being ripped from her wheelchair and arrested for protesting outside Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's office went viral last week. We'll link to your column in Vox. I was pulled out of my wheelchair by police. It could be worse. Trump care could pass. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to Michael Leidy of National Nurses United to talk about single payer and what happened in California. It passed in the state Senate, but then was pulled in the state assembly. We'll find out why. Stay with us.
Dicen que yo soy peligrosa, que yo soy dolorosa, porque quiero vivir así. Dicen que yo soy enjundiosa, caprichosa y hermosa, que no puedo seguir así. Te digo que sí soy peligrosa, que sí soy dolorosa, porque te quiero para mí. Si soy afanosa, intrépida, costosa, que quiero lo bueno para mí, no sé lo que siento contigo, pero
Peligrosa, Dangerous Woman by Leela Downs, singing here at our Democracy Now! Studio from her latest album, Salón, Lágrimas y Deseo. To see her full interview and performance, go to democracynow.org. Yes, this is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Earlier this month, the California State Senate passed a bill that would establish a single-payer health care system for the entire state. The proposal, called the Healthy California Act, was later killed by State Assembly Speaker Anthony Rendon, even though the plan had widespread support. A poll commissioned by the California Nurses Association found 70% of all Californians are in favor of a single-payer plan. For more, we go to Berkeley, California, to be joined by Michael Leidy, the Director of Public Policy for National Nurses United and the California Nurses Association. So, Michael, can you talk about this growing movement? I mean, at the national level, you now have Senator Warren, who just came out in the Wall Street Journal saying she's for single-payer. Of course, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont has also said the same thing, though he hasn't introduced the latest bill. But in California, this debate has been raging. What happened?
Well, Amy, it is quite remarkable because we got single-payer passed through the state Senate on June 1st, 23-14 vote, and we have huge momentum. I think ultimately we had 400 organizations who were with us in the Assembly, in the Senate rather, for the bill and continuing to support it. We've had major demonstrations all over the state, town halls in every region of California. There is a huge groundswell for this reform, and it's exactly why we need to do it, as pointed out by your previous story. This inaction, in this case, literally means death. California, governed by Democrats, two-thirds majority in both the Assembly and Senate with a Democratic governor, must act urgently to prevent the worst impacts of this GOP health plan from coming true in California.
Well, explain what was passed in the California State Senate. Explain exactly what single-payer or Medicare for all is.
Essentially what we do is we're able to eliminate all insurance company premiums, deductibles, and copays and have a new entity, what we call the Healthy California, provide health care through paying providers. So we eliminate all the waste and inefficiency of the present system. We're able to reimburse providers based on Medicare rates. We're able to pay comprehensive benefits, complete choice of provider as we eliminate the insurance company premiums, deductibles, and copays and replace that with public financing. Currently, 70% of healthcare expenses in California are paid by taxpayers. We're just not getting our money's worth. And so what a single payer does is essentially use the leverage of everybody in one system to contain prices, to guarantee health care for all Californians, including those who are undocumented. So it is actually the best type of reform because we're able to use those efficiencies to actually save money. We estimated $37 billion can be saved by going to this Medicare for all type system in California.
And so explain the politics of what happened in the state assembly, although the state Senate passed it.
Well, it's pretty straightforward. Those deep-pocket interests that fund, including Democrats, are opposed to this bill. You've got the healthcare industry has given the Speaker, along with the insurance industry, over $700,000, and he's the one who stopped progress on this bill. He's essentially denied democracy on behalf of the healthcare industry. There are opponents of this that clearly have a great deal at stake. The insurance companies in California have earned $27 billion in net income. So no surprise, Amy, that they want to hold on to those profits.
And what do you say to those who actually do support Medicare for all or single-payer health care, but feel it cannot be done on a state-by-state basis? Explain how it would work if the country doesn't have single-payer, but California did.
Well, it is parallel in some sense. California is the 6th largest economy in the country, and the governor is committed to being a major player in climate action, and so he has the resources of a nation to do that. We believe he also has the resources of a nation to guarantee health care for all Californians. Californians are entitled to the federal spending on health care for which they're eligible, just as every other state. So we're going to get that money into California. The Affordable Care Act, under the 1332 provision, is explicitly designed to enable states to set up single-payer type universal health care systems. There's a statutory language in there to do so. So those waivers also under Medicaid are available to channel those monies. This administration, for its horror show on healthcare, the one thing that it does say that might be useful here is it's in favor of state innovation. And certainly, there is nothing more innovative than saving people and businesses billions of dollars as we provide comprehensive coverage to everybody. So we believe there's a statutory basis and a belief that we can do this in California because we have the resources to do so.
So I wanted to turn to Harvard professor John McDonough, who we've had on a number of times, the chief architect of what many call Romney Care in Massachusetts, the model for the Affordable Care Act. McDonough also was involved with the passage of the Affordable Care Act. When we spoke to him a few years ago, in 2012, McDonough said he supports single-payer but doesn't think it's feasible.
I think a single-payer plan could be far preferable. The reality was that there was no possibility in 2009, 2010 of achieving passage of anything close to a single payer. And I think really the question is, does the Affordable Care Act move the system forward by eliminating pre-existing conditions, by creating the Medicaid expansions, by undertaking so many other important improvements to the healthcare system, tripling the size of the National Health Service Corps, providing important new funding for community health centers, just many, many important provisions. I think that short of a single-payer system, that the Affordable Care Act was the best that we could get done, and that it really will provide significant, meaningful, important improvements for the lives and the health and the well-being of many, many millions of Americans.
So in your last response, Michael Lighty, if you could respond to what Professor McDonough says, and also talk about these polls. Pew saying about a third of Americans now are for single-payer, maybe 60% believe the federal government should be involved with health insurance, guaranteeing health insurance.
Yes, I think that's exactly right, Amy. There is a groundswell for the federal government to guarantee health care for all. That is even stronger in California. Even after people hear the opposition arguments in California, 58% support this type of reform, this type of Medicare for all reform. We did meet with John McDonough and Senator Kennedy when he was still alive during the health care debate around the Affordable Care Act. We just disagree that the tax subsidy of the purchase of private health insurance is going to get us to universal coverage. The Affordable Care Act still, at best case scenario, 29 million uninsured nationwide. In California, that number is 2.7 million, but the real number is underinsured. 15 million Californians have such high deductibles that they cannot get the health care they need. So in terms of health security, in terms of peace of mind, in terms of guaranteeing health care as a human right, we are not there, and that's why we must keep pressing forward. And California can literally lead the nation in doing so, and we can prove to John and the other skeptics that, in fact, if we institute a policy that eliminates the nefarious role that insurance companies provide, we can guarantee health care for all. That's really the evolution that we need to make from the Affordable Care Act.
Michael Lighty, I want to thank you for being with us, Director of Public Policy for National Nurses United and the California Nurses Association. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, author Naomi Klein on No is Not Enough. Minstrel by Philip Koran and the Artistic Heritage Ensemble. Koran, a legendary trumpeter, composer, spiritual jazz innovator, died Wednesday at the age of 90. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report, as we wrap up today's show with part 2 of our conversation with best-selling author and journalist Naomi Klein, author of The Shock Doctrine and This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. Her new book is called No is Not Enough, Resisting Trump's Shock Politics and Winning the World We Need. To accompany the book, The Intercept recently made this video.
Shocking.
I don't think I could sit down right now.
You mean
historic, astounding, shocking.
it's a word that's come up a lot since November, for obvious reasons.
He's going to inject a shock to the system.
Now, I've spent a lot of time thinking about shock. 10 years ago, I published The Shock Doctrine, an investigation that spanned 4 decades from Pinochet's U.S.-backed coup in 1970s Chile to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. I noticed a brutal and recurring tactic by right-wing governments. After a shocking event, a war, a coup, a terrorist attack, market crash, or natural disaster, exploit the public's disorientation, suspend democracy, push through radical policies that enrich the 1% at the expense of the poor and middle class.
This is a repeal and a replace of Obamacare.
We are going to cut taxes and simplify the tax code.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
Now, some people have said that's exactly what Trump has been trying to do. Is it true? Well, sort of, but in all likelihood, the worst is yet to come, and we'd better be ready. The administration is creating chaos daily.
Breaking news. Donald Trump's national security advisor, Michael Flynn, has resigned tonight.
All of a sudden, the White House is concerned about James Comey's handling of Hillary Clinton's email.
A Senate committee will question President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, Jared Kushner, about his meeting with officials from a Russian bank.
Now, of course, many of the scandals are the result of the president's ignorance and blunders, not some nefarious strategy. But there's also no doubt that some savvy people around Trump are using the daily shocks as cover to advance wildly pro-corporate policies that bear little resemblance to what Trump pledged on the campaign trail.
Save Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security.
The White House released its budget for 2018, and among the $4 trillion in cuts it proposes are billions upon billions of dollars slashed from both Medicaid and Social Security.
And the worst part? This is likely just the warm-up. We need to focus on what this administration will do when it has a major external shock to exploit. Maybe it'll be an economic crash like 2008. Maybe a natural disaster like Sandy. Or maybe it'll be a horrific terrorist event like Manchester or Paris in 2015. Any one such crisis could redraw the political map overnight. And it could give Trump and his crew free rein to ram through their most extreme ideas. But here is one thing I've learned over 2 decades of reporting from dozens of crises around the world. These tactics can be resisted. And for your convenience, I've tried to boil it down to a 5-step plan. Step 1, know what's coming. What would happen if a horror like the one in Manchester took place on U.S. soil? Based on Trump's obvious fondness for authoritarianism, we can expect him to impose some sort of state of exception or emergency, where the usual rules of democracy no longer apply. Protests and strikes that block roads and airports, like the ones that sprung up to resist the Muslim travel ban, would likely be declared a threat to national security. Protest organizers would be targeted under anti-terror legislation, with surveillance, arrests, and imprisonment. With public signs of dissent suppressed, the truly toxic to-do list would quickly bubble up. Bring in the feds to pacify the streets. Muzzle investigative journalism. You know he's itching to.
You weren't called. Sit down.
The courts, who Trump would inevitably blame for the attacks, might well lose their courage. And the most lethal shock we need to prepare for? A push for a full-blown foreign war. And no, it won't matter if the target has no connection to the attacks used to justify it.
What did Iraq have to do with what? The attack on the World Trade Center. Nothing.
Preparing for all this is crucial. If we know what to expect, we won't be that shocked. We'll just be, and that's important for step 2. Get out of your home and defy the bans. When governments tell people to stay in their homes or show their patriotism by going shopping, they inevitably claim it's for public safety, that protests and rallies could become targets for more attacks. What we know from other countries is that there is only one way to respond.
Hundreds of Tunisians have been defying the curfew in the capital, Tunis.
Disobey en masse. That's what happened in Argentina in 2001. With the country in economic freefall, the president at the time declared a state of siege, giving himself the power to suspend the Constitution.
Decretado el estado de sitio en todo el territorio nacional.
He told the public to stay in their houses. Here's what they did instead. The president resigned that night, and eventually new elections were held. 3 years later, in Madrid, a horrifying series of coordinated attacks on trains killed more than 200 people. The prime minister, José María Aznar, falsely pointed the finger at Basque separatists and also used the attacks to justify his decision to send troops to Iraq. His rhetoric was classic shock doctrine: division, war, fear, daddy will protect you. This is how Spaniards responded. They voted out Aznar a few days later. Many people said they did it because he reminded them of Franco, Spain's former dictator. Which brings us to step 3, know your history. Throughout U.S. history, national crises have been used to suspend constitutional protections and attack basic rights. After the Civil War, with the nation in crisis, the promise of 40 acres and a mule to freed slaves was promptly betrayed. In the midst of the pain and panic of the Great Depression, as many as 2 million people of Mexican descent were expelled from the United States. After the Pearl Harbor attacks, around 120,000 Japanese Americans were jailed in internment camps. If an attack on U.S. soil were perpetrated by people who were not white and Christian, we can be pretty damn sure that racists would have a field day. And the good folks of Manchester recently showed us how to respond to that.
People in Manchester don't stand with your xenophobia and racism.
Something else we know from history. Step 4, always follow the money. While everyone is focused on security and civil liberties, Trump's cabinet of billionaires will try to quietly push through even more extreme measures to enrich themselves and their class, like dismantling Social Security or auctioning off major pieces of government for profit.
Today we're proposing to take American air travel into the future.
It's in those moments when fear and chaos are sucking up all the oxygen when we most have to ask, whose interests are being served by the chaos? What is being slipped through while we're distracted? Who's getting richer? And who's getting even poorer?
When the floodwaters were still rising in New Orleans, one of the first official acts that the governor did was to fire all the teachers. What's happening is a raid of the money set aside for public education to be given to private companies. It wasn't by happenstance, it was by design. You saw the political manipulations and taking advantage of the crisis.
But if we learn from this history, we could actually make history with step 5, advance a bold counterplan. At their best, all the previous steps can only slow down attempts to exploit crisis. If we actually want to defeat this tactic, opponents of the shock doctrine need to move quickly to put forward a credible alternate plan. It needs to get at the root of why these sorts of crises are hitting us with ever greater frequency. And that means we have to talk about militarism, climate change, and deregulated markets. More than that, we need to advance and fight for different models, ones grounded in racial, economic, and gender justice, ones that hold out the credible promise of a tangibly better and fairer life in the here and now, and a safer planet for all of us in the long term. Defensive actions alone won't cut it. There has to be a different vision, and it needs to be bold. Saying no to the shock doctrine is vitally important. But when the hits the fan, no is not enough.
That video, produced by The Intercept, their senior correspondent Naomi Klein, author of the new book released this week, No is Not Enough, Resisting Trump's Shock Politics and Winning the World We Need. Yes, a shock. You're a specialist in analyzing what happens next, Naomi.
Right, and the reason why I wrote this book very quickly, for me, it usually takes me 5 years to write a book. I did this in less than 5 months, is because I really wanted it to come out before any kind of major crisis hits the United States. I mean, lots of people out there see Trump himself as a crisis, and I would tend to agree, but what really has me scared is what this configuration of characters in the Trump administration, Pence, Bannon, Betsy DeVos, Steve Mnuchin, all these Goldman Sachs alum who are in the cabinet, how they would respond to a large-scale crisis that they themselves are not creating. I mean, the chaos is chaos they're generating themselves, either deliberately or out of incompetence and avarice. But what happens if there's a 2008-like financial crisis? What happens, heaven forbid, if there is a Manchester-like attack in the United States? The actions of this administration make these types of shocks more likely, not less, right? They're deregulating the banks, creating the conditions for another crash. They are antagonizing the world, particularly the Muslim world. ISIS apparently called Trump's Muslim travel ban a blessed ban because it was so good for recruitment. They are making climate disasters more likely with everything they're doing to deregulate industry, deregulate for polluters. There's a lag time between that and when the climate shocks hit. But the truth is we've already warmed the planet enough that no U.S. president can get through a year, let alone a term, without some sort of major climate-related disaster. So how does this cabinet of disaster capitalists, this is what I call them, Amy, because there is such a track record of taking advantage of crisis, whether we're looking at the former Goldman Sachs executives and the way they profited from the subprime mortgage crisis to increase their own personal wealth, whether it's Mike Pence and the central role he played when New Orleans was still underwater to come up with a corporate wish list to push through. So, as disastrous as Trump's policies have been so far, there's actually a long, toxic to-do list, things that people around Trump and Trump himself have very openly said they would like to do, but they have actually not been able either to get through without a crisis, or they haven't even tried, right? Think about Trump's threats to bring back torture. Think about his threats to bring the feds into Chicago. Think about his threats not just to have a Muslim travel ban from specific countries, but not to let Muslims into the country, period. So I think we do need to prepare for this, and what I tried to do with this video is create a little toolkit of what I have seen work in other countries, because have been reporting on shocks and large-scale disasters and how societies respond now for a couple of decades, and I've seen some amazing acts of resistance.
And talk about those. We saw some images of them here.
Yeah. So, one of the things I think we could really count on Trump to do, particularly if there is any kind of terrorism-related shock, and let's be clear, there have been terrorism events, white supremacist terrorism in the United States during the Trump era, but of course he doesn't treat those as a crisis. So an event that they decided was a large-scale crisis. We already know from the way Trump responded to the London Bridge attacks. He immediately said, this is why we need to bring back my travel ban. After the Manchester attacks, he immediately said, this is about immigrants flooding across our borders. In fact, the person responsible for those attacks was born in the UK. It doesn't matter. We know this from 9/11, that the way these crises are used as opportunities to push through policies that actually have very little to do with getting at root causes, and in many cases exacerbate, most notably the invasion of Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11, but it was just that sheer opportunism. So, what I've seen is, I think in all likelihood they would declare a state of emergency, some sort of state of exception, where they're able to ban protests, like the protests we saw, the very inspiring protests in the face of the Muslim travel ban. They would say, no, you can't block a road, you can't block an airport. This is, you could be a target of terrorism yourself, stay in your homes. So, I give a few examples, like Argentina in 2001, when, as the president was declaring a state of siege and telling people to stay in their homes, people describe not being able to hear him because the sound from the streets was so loud, the roar of pots and pans, and neighbors flooding out of their homes and going to the Plaza de Mayo and refusing this state of siege. Was they drowned him out. They literally couldn't hear him, so other people left their houses. And, in that moment, that's the moment to resist. That is the moment to just not accept it. And it's really a question of strength in numbers, because if it is only the kind of hardcore activists that are out on the streets, it's really easy to crush small protests. It's harder to do it when it is hundreds of thousands of people. So I wanted to share some of these stories of societies that have just said, we will not let you do it. Right? I was in France, as were you, Amy, a week after the horrific terrorist attacks in 2015. We were there for the Paris Climate Summit. A week before, 200 people had been killed in Paris in coordinated attacks. The French government, under François Hollande, a socialist government, socialist in name only, but a left government, declared a state of emergency and banned political gatherings of more than 5 people. If that can happen in France under a socialist government in a country with a very deep history of disruptive strikes, what do we expect Trump and Bannon and Pence to do at the earliest opportunity? So I think it's important to strategize. It's important to know the history in the United States. In all these countries, the examples I give, Argentina, why did they flood out of their houses? You ask people, they said, it reminded us of the beginning of the dictatorship in 1976. That's how it started. They told us that we weren't safe and that it was going to be a temporary state of emergency, and it ended up turning into a dictatorship. So they saw the early signs and they said, no, not again, nunca más, right? We talk to Americans about this, they say, well, we don't have that history. Really? What about the Japanese internment? What about, as you've written, Amy, what about what happened to Mexican Americans in the United States during the Great Depression and during that crisis and the mass deportations? There is this history in many communities, and those communities keep that history alive. During Hurricane Katrina, so many African Americans talked about the history of how crises had been used to further oppress Black people in this country. But these stories are offloaded into those communities who hold them and keep that history alive. It isn't nationally metabolized, right? And so we have to share these stories. And I do think there is a memory now of what happened after September 11th and the rights that were lost and the ways in which people's grief was exploited by men in power who said, trust me. Don't make that mistake again.
What about the connection to war? I mean, you have what happened in Manchester, the horror there. You have the continued deaths in Yemen, the U.S.-backed Saudi bombing. Now the U.S. has expanded both in Somalia and in the Philippines with U.S. forces. You have this horrific attack that took place in Kabul, where over 150 Afghans died. It hardly got any attention. But the rage that must be brewing at the grassroots when they don't get any media attention from the West.
Right. people are being erased. And this is a very, very old story. No, they're already expanding the battlefields, escalating on multiple fronts, and this is the most dangerous, most lethal way that shocking events are exploited. People's fear is exploited. And, let's remember that this administration will have various motivations for changing the subject away from their domestic scandals. And, Trump has never gotten better media coverage than in the wake of his Syrian missile strike, called Beautiful by Brian Williams. And it's, suddenly he was presidential, right, ordering cruise missiles over delicious chocolate cake at Mar-a-Lago. So, we have to be very, very vigilant about this. And, the U.S. Has had a strong anti-war movement in the past, but that anti-war movement, hasn't been in the streets in the same way. And I think that these resistance movements are going to have to get ready for that kind of a shock, because once the wars begin, it's very hard to stop them. Another example, I think, of shock resistance we just saw in the UK during Jeremy Corbyn's campaign, where Theresa May was exploiting the Manchester attacks, the London Bridge attacks, to say we're going to have to get rid of your online privacy. We need backdoors into all of your communication apps. We may need to suspend human rights law. And Jeremy Corbyn was talking about root causes, the failure of the war on terror paradigm, and how this is leading, to an increase in these types of attacks. And, I think that a lot of people decided that made more sense after these many years, like not to double down and give up rights in these moments, but try to understand why this is happening and to do something about it.
And so Theresa May lost her conservative majority in the parliament. On Saudi Arabia, the first country President Trump went to, the first foreign country, was Saudi Arabia. He does the orb with the Saudi Arabians. He does the sword dances, or tries, with the Saudi Arabians. He seals these deals well over $110 billion, leaves there extolling the Saudi leadership and attacks the European leaders, and then comes home, and despite the almost begging of the European leaders on the issue of the climate accord, he not only attacks them, but then comes home to the United States and announces he's withdrawing from the very accord they're pleading with him to remain in. What about this primacy of Saudi Arabia right now, both its connection to war with the U.S.-backed Saudi bombing of Yemen, which is leading to a horrific cholera epidemic, not to mention just the number of deaths, and climate change?
One of the things that really worries me is how motivated these petrostates are to have more instability, because that sends the price of oil up, and, their profits flow even more. It's something that the Saudis have in common with the Russians, have in common with Rex Tillerson, former CEO of Exxon. The way I think we should see that foreign trip of Trump's is basically he's a traveling weapons salesman, right? And he's sending this message: you buy enough American weapons, you're our friend. This is the price. So he heaps praise on Saudi Arabia for, having done that, having made that deal. And he goes to Europe and he screams at them, NATO members, for not pulling their weight, right? Which means not buying enough weapons. I'm Canadian. I'm Canadian-American dual citizen, but my government shamefully came home and announced a massive increase in weapons spending. This is Trump's foreign policy. He's a traveling weapons salesman.
Best-selling author Naomi Klein, senior correspondent for The Intercept. Her new book is titled No Is Not Enough: Resisting Trump's Shock Politics and Winning the World We Need. To see part one of the interview, you can go to democracynow.org. On Monday and Tuesday, 2 July 4th specials will bring you a major address by Senator Bernie Sanders at the People's Summit in Chicago before about 4,000 people. That's Monday's show, July 3rd. And on Tuesday, James Earl Jones reads Frederick Douglass's historic speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And we talk to the chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe about the standoff at Standing Rock and where it stands today. Happy birthday to Isis Phillips. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.